Welcome to Graywood Gardening. It is just about the middle of July now, and it is hot and it is humid and it is miserable out. So I actually try to spend as little time outside as possible right now. So for the veggie garden, I'm actually right now only coming out once a week to take care of it early in the morning, other than coming out to harvest stuff as needed. So I thought today I would take you with me while I do my weekly upkeep on the veggie garden, and then maybe talk a little bit about each of the things I'm growing, the strategies I'm using, or the experiments I'm conducting. All right, so the very first thing we're gonna do is harvest whatever needs to be harvested, get that out of the way, and then we'll get to work. Come on. I'm doing an experiment with my onions this year in hopes of growing larger onion bulbs. And specifically what I've done is on half of my onions, I cut them a couple weeks ago. I cut half of the tops off. The idea here is twofold. Number one, to keep these large tops from getting too heavy and falling over, because if they crimp the neck of the onion, that's it, it's done. But also supposedly this encourages more new growth. And for an onion bulb, each one of these little green leaves that it sends up is another layer of the onion. So the more of these you have, the bigger your bulb is. So yeah, this year I did it on just half of them so that when it's onion harvest time, we can actually compare the size of these onions to these onions. This is also an important part of one of the goals of gardening this year, which Mrs. Graywood wants at the end of summer to be able to make salsa with only ingredients from our garden, except, you know, the lime. The tomato bed behind me here has gotten to be a little bit of a jungle. This is the first time I am trying growing the vining tomatoes up on the trellis in the same bed as the caged tomatoes, which most of these are determinate Roma tomatoes. I somehow in my mind thought there would be plenty of space because these ones are growing up, but they're really growing into each other pretty tightly. For the tomato bed today, we need to pinch out suckers off of the vining tomatoes, tie them up on trellises, but then also just generally try to prune the tomatoes in general to improve airflow. The next thing that I look on doing for the trellising tomatoes, actually for all of them, is pruning up from the bottom. I really want air to be able to flow underneath the plant. So for the vining tomato, for the indeterminate tomatoes at least, I will always, once the plant gets a decent size, cut off any leaves that are below the lowest fruit. But also using some common sense, right? For a little tiny plant, I'm not going to do that. But for a giant, dense monster like this, I might even prune leaves up above that just to give some amount of airflow. Like you can barely even see the tomatoes in here. I have two plants on this trellis, and each plant I let one sprout grow, so each one I have growing is 2 vines. There's 4 vines across the trellis. Same thing I did last year, but ooh, such dense foliage. I think that is good for these 2 plants. All right, and the final thing I do is I tie up the vines that aren't growing quite in the direction I want to. So one of the things that I try to do as much as I can is actually pull the plant to grow in one set of the panel, then out the other, and try to get it to stay up that way. Ooh, I'm not always enough on the ball with that, so I often am having to tie things up to keep them spaced apart. So I just use string. I don't use anything fancy. This string is green so that it doesn't stand out and look too ugly. Oh no! Oh, shoot skis. I just broke the top of this off, which is the problem with the weaving method. If it's slightly too big, it's really easy to snap. So this guy's going to stop growing for a little bit, but eventually, in fact, already a new shoot is just starting to grow here, and I'll let that new shoot grow up. Okay, and that is it for these 2 cherry tomatoes. Now let's take a look at the Roma tomatoes, which are determinate. All right, so I don't know if you can tell from the big mess of tomatoes, but like here in a cage is a single Roma tomato, and I have 3 of these. These are determinate tomatoes, and I'm not nearly as aggressive as I am with the indeterminate in pruning these. The main 3 things that I do is I try again to trim them up from the bottom to try to get good airflow underneath and get the leaves up away from the dirt where the fungus lives, so the rain is less likely to splash it up onto the leaves. Number 2, every now and then you'll get a branch that grows way outside of the cage and it's just obviously not going to be able to hold up the tomatoes, in which case I'll nip that branch off. And number 3 is sometimes you get this huge, just dense mess of leaves growing inward inside the cage that get all trapped up, and I'll thin those out a little bit to make room for the tomatoes. But in general, it's a lot less pruning than it is for the indeterminate. So I'll just repeat this on the next 2, and then I've got one final tomato to deal with. All right, so this is the cucumber vines. The 2 things that I'm doing here is, number 1, I am pruning, because these vines keep growing more and more offshoots, so I'm generally cutting off these offshoot vines. Partially because I don't have enough space for this many offshoots. I don't want them growing along the ground, but again, the reason we're growing up the trellis in the first place is to try to prevent powdery mildew from taking over the plant. Powdery mildew is a problem with anything in the cucurbit family, as well as monardas, so bee balms and stuff. But so anything that is cucurbit, which is all of your squashes and pumpkins, zucchinis and cucumbers, are susceptible to powdery mildew. So I'm going to cut off all of these offshoots. I'm also going to work on tying them up. Now, cucumber vines really well. It grabs onto the trellis all by itself, but it doesn't always go where I want it to. So like there's a vine right here that grew up and then took a right turn and is all the way over here now and is grabbing on.
Here's the cucumber flower for
Oh,
you.
thank you for the cucumber flower. That's very pretty.
It smells really pretty because it's actually cucumber.
Oh, okay. So this one's grabbing on here, so I'm going to cut it loose, put it straight up and tie it on to try to keep this to individual upward branches. So it's going to be a lot of trimming of the vines and then just a little bit of tying up. Oh, there's another one. All right, right here we have 2 cantaloupe plants, and the goal here is to grow them up this back fence, again, to provide good airflow and to prevent powdery mildew. Now, unlike the cucumber, cantaloupe is not a really good climber by itself, so I basically need to tie this up everywhere that I want it to vine, and I'm also going to cut off some of these vines growing along the ground. I might actually leave one of them just for funsies. Ooh, maybe this one. There's a wee teeny tiny cantaloupe growing on it. But I do want to get some of this foliage cut out from underneath so that we can get airflow under here. The spring broccoli is done now. We had actually a really good harvest this year. It was our most successful year for spring broccoli. I tried a new variety, which I think is called Eastern Magic. So I don't know if it was just conditions or getting in late or our cool spring and cool start of June that made it so great, or if it was the new variety, but very happy with what we harvested. I do plan, in a month or so from now, to put in a full bed of broccoli that should be ready to harvest in late fall. So we'll see how that does. It is amazing how long these little chores can take. I've been in the garden for about 3 hours now, so I just took a break to get a dry shirt. But the final thing that I really have to do is fertilizing. I use a liquid seaweed fish emulsion fertilizer for all of the heavy feeders. So mostly that's just the tomatoes and the sweet corn and also the potatoes in pots, because I like to fertilize everything in a pot. I'll do that every week. Every third week, I will also fertilize the zucchini, the cucumber, the cantaloupe, and the butternut squash. And once the cantaloupe and butternut squash actually have fruit, I'll probably up them to getting fertilized once a week too. But everything else in the garden is usually good with just the blood meal that it gets when I set up the beds in the spring. All right. This stuff is stinky. It's also worth noting this fertilizer is a 3-2-2, so a little heavier on the nitrogen, lower on the phosphorus and potassium, because I happen to know that in my gardens I have plenty of phosphorus, generally plenty of potassium, and it's nitrogen that I'm usually short on. So even plants that I want to be fruiting and producing fruit, they still need some nitrogen. All right. The sweet corn is doing phenomenal this year. Although to be fair, it was doing just about as good at this time last year, and then it started suffering when the ears started forming, mostly from not enough water. But I increased the spacing, and I'm going to be conscious about watering the corn this August, even if everything else in the garden doesn't need water. Potatoes in pots are continuing to grow super well. I cannot wait until I get to tip these out and see if we actually get potatoes out of it and if we get just teeny little ones or actually decent sized red potatoes. So a new chore I've had to add to the list is here in the mint bed. I have a spearmint growing on this side that's doing well, because these were just tiny little plants that I planted like a month ago. It's doing well, but the peppermint on this side is going gangbusters. And you can see here, it is starting to send shoots out over this little board, trying to invade the territory of the spearmint. So I'm just gonna nip these off once a week to keep the spearmint on this side. I'm excited that the peppermint is growing so well. I'm going to wait for it to fill up the rest of this bed, and then we'll harvest a whole bunch of it and make peppermint extract out of it, which we'll then use for our holiday baking this year, maybe also for making some mint chocolate chip ice cream. All right, this is the annual herb bed, and at least on this end, the herbs have not done well at all. I think this is because I got them in late and it was really hot. I direct seeded them. So I'm gonna steal this space for a second crop of zucchini. I'm just gonna grow one green zucchini, one yellow zucchini, just as a backup in case my main zucchini fall to squash vine borer. Because right now, squash vine borer adults are no longer flying. So anything we plant now should not be in danger of squash vine borers. So I think, it smells good. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up a corner here and a corner there, water them in, and as they grow, I'll pull the rest of the herbs out. All right. So I'm just going to toss in 2 seeds in each spot, and in theory, 2 plants will grow, and I'll just pull one of them out so that there's just one. 1, 2. 1, 2. Now, the downside to planting at the height of summer is I'm going to have to remember to come out here every day for the next week or so to keep this watered, to keep the seed coat wet so that they can start growing. All right, the garlic is looking like it's getting really close to being ready to harvest. I've got this one right here that's kind of fallen over, so I think I'm going to pull that up just to check. My hunch is we need a couple more weeks yet on the garlic. I didn't bring a shovel, There's a stick over here. All right. Hey, look at that. That's a decent sized garlic head. But just judging by how pronounced the cloves are within the bulb, I think this could go a little longer, but I think it's maybe going to be 1 week, not 2 weeks. And then these guys will all be ready to get pulled up. Which is awesome because the garlic we have right now in the house, I still have garlic from last year's harvest in the basement, like 3 more bulbs left. It's starting to grow like a little green stem from it, but the garlic's still good. So the garlic that I grew last year lasted us all year long. This year, I'm growing a lot more garlic so that we'll have enough garlic to last us all year and enough garlic to plant this fall's crop, so I'll never have to buy seed garlic or store garlic again. All right, well, I think that is everything that I need to do here in the veggie garden today. It is hot, it is miserable out, and it's time for lunch, so I'm gonna head in. I hope that you guys are staying cool and not getting too blasted by the heat in your gardening. Until next time, happy gardening.